Good evening, everybody. I hope you can all hear me well. And good morning to Dr. Knowles, who's speaking to us from Korea. I'm thrilled to be a co-host of this event, highlighting the superb work of the historian and prolific podcast host, Scott Gabriel Knowles. This is the first of 3 events we've arranged for this week's Pandemic Reflection Series. My name is Roy Richard Grinker. I'm a professor of anthropology at George Washington University, and I've been involved with this study from the outset. The second of our events is tomorrow, Against Forgetting, Bearing Witness Through Pandemic Narratives, an in-person event from 4 to 6:30 p.m. at the Elliott School for International Affairs at 1957 E Street at GW, where we'll have a joint book presentation about COVID-19 loss and remembrance with authors Martha Greenwald and Nicholas Montemurano. The program will include pre-recorded remarks by Dr. Anthony Fauci. The third event, on March 7th, will be Where the Flags Are Today, a visit to the home of In America Remember. It is all afternoon, from 1 to 7 at the studio of Suzanne Brennan Furstenberg at 4800 Auburn Avenue in Bethesda, Maryland. The event offers the first public access to the physical and digital archive of Suzanne Brennan Furstenberg's memorial art installations. In America, which was on the National Mall in Washington, D.C. in September and October of 2021, and In America, How Could This Happen, held at the D.C. Armory from October to November of 2020. The event today is part of a larger project that Professor Sarah Wagner, Professor Joel Kuipers, and I started about 4 years ago. The project, entitled Rituals in the Making, was motivated by the urgent need to examine the changes in religious, funeral, and commemorative practices due to the COVID-19 pandemic. Specifically, we sought to observe and analyze how rituals typically conducted in the physical presence of others were being transformed into virtual sites and practices. The research has been funded by generous grants from the National Science Foundation, the Institute for Data, Democracy, and Politics at the George Washington University, and the John S. and James L. Knight Foundation. I also want to acknowledge the special efforts of our project manager, Lean Alfatafta, a PhD student in anthropology here at GW. Our research team is made up of anthropology faculty and, all told over the years, more than 24 students at GW. Together, we study how the pandemic has changed the way we grieve and remember, asking such questions as, how have rituals typically conducted in the physical presence of others been adapted to virtual spaces? How have various media, especially social media, affected mourning and remembrance? How have COVID-19 mourners defined and pursued accountability in their efforts to counter misinformation and disinformation? We have done well over 100 interviews with, among others, funeral directors, religious leaders, death doulas, hospice care workers, memorial organizers, activists, artists, and mourners. Much of our work is highlighted on our website, ritualsinthemaking.com, and in social media posts. I invite you to follow us on X, which is @ritualsinmaking, Facebook, Rituals in the Making, and Instagram, Rituals in the Making. Throughout, our focus has been not only on conducting research, but training graduate and undergraduate students in methods of rigorous social scientific data collection and analysis. The students may have the title of, quote, research assistant, unquote, but they are in fact the co-leaders of our work. They spearheaded research initiatives, organized events, populated our website, ritualsinthemaking.com, and co-authored articles and presentations. I sincerely hope that they have experienced this project as our academic peers, because that is how we see them. And so it is my pleasure to introduce one of our students, one of our research assistants, Sebastian Sirais, a student at the Elliott School of International Affairs, studying international affairs and sociology. He's been with our project since 2021, and his work concerns commemoration of COVID loss, digital commemoration, and virtual mourning. Without further ado then, Sebastian Sirais.
Thank you very much, Professor Grinker. First, I just wanted to thank everyone who's come together to make this seminar series possible. I'd especially like to thank our principal investigators, Professors Richard Grinker, Sarah Wagner, and Joel Kuipers. I'd also like to thank all of my fellow research assistants who have been with the project these past 4 years. And finally, I would like to thank authors Martha Greenwald and Nicholas Montemurano. Both of them are hosting a panel tomorrow that I think everyone should go to. I'll share more information about that during our concluding remarks. Working on the project as a student at the George Washington University has been an amazing opportunity for both myself and the other research assistants. We've been given the chance to not just participate in, but direct research across multiple disciplines. Throughout my time with Rituals in the Making, we have been able to interact with virtual commemorative groups across the country to discuss memorialization and misinformation. We have participated in COVID-19 archival efforts through our collaboration with Suzanne Furstenberg of the In America Remember Project. And we have gone directly to the halls of Congress to study the effects of misinformation at the highest levels of our nation's government. With that, I would like to introduce you all to our speaker today, Professor Scott Gabriel Knowles. Professor Knowles is a disaster historian who currently serves as a professor in the graduate school at the Korea Advanced Institute of Science and Technology. He is the host of COVID Calls, a podcast series dedicated to facilitating conversations with experts, policymakers, and other individuals affected by the COVID-19 pandemic to better understand its evolving effects on global society. Please hold your questions until the end of the presentation. That's when we will open up the chat for our Q&A session. I'll go ahead and turn the floor over to him. Thank you for joining us today, Professor Knowles.
Okay, thank you, Sebastian. Can you hear me okay? Okay, great. Well, I wish I was there with you in person for the events that you have going on in these days. I'm in South Korea, where I'm calling from this morning here. And I want to begin by thanking the co-PIs on this terrific project, Rituals in the Making, Sarah Wagner, Roy Grinker, and Joel Kuipers. And I want to also acknowledge and thank thank Martha Greenwald for getting me involved in this as well, and for her brilliance, and for being a guest on COVID Calls. And let me also thank Sebastian Sirais for that nice introduction and for his really excellent work in helping to organize my participation. Today, I want to take a moment here at the stop. Ordinarily, and when I would do COVID Calls, I read an obituary, but I'm not going to do that today. I will just acknowledge that we are in the COVID Memorial Days, and acknowledge that there's 7,003,000 global deaths from COVID-19. Those are recorded deaths, and 1,181,607 deaths attributed to COVID, most recently by the Centers for Disease Control. Surely an undercount, and mostly avoidable. I'm going to talk about COVID and memory today. And I'd like to start by, I'm going to spend a few minutes talking to you about a conversation I had 2 years ago with the sociologist and artist Gonzalo Bacigalupe. He was my 501st COVID Calls episode. It's hard to believe it's been over 2 years now, almost 2 years since I stopped doing that daily practice. But for the first 2 years of the pandemic, I did COVID Calls every single day. It was a daily live podcast discussion. I started by talking with people who were close in my research network. I'm a disaster historian. I work with social scientists, anthropologists, sociologists, economists, people who think about disasters and their social impacts and the social processes that made them. But like you, I'm sure as the pandemic went on into the summer of 2020, I was looking much more broadly for knowledge, for emotional contact, and for understanding. And so by the time we had finished 501 episodes, we had talked to everyone from anthropologists to zoologists and faith leaders and first responders and doctors and artists. And I encourage you, if you have time, to check out the COVID Calls archive. It's just covid-calls.com, and you can find every episode there, many of which already the transcripts are available also. But what I want to focus on here is my discussion that I had with Gonzalo. and a particular piece of artwork that he shared with me on that day, April 4th, 2022. And you see it here on the screen. It's just a section of it. I'll give you a second just to sort of try to get your mind around it and the colors and the numbers and the interplay between those. And I asked him about this piece. Gonzalo, early on in the pandemic, had agreed to contribute artwork for the COVID Calls website. And he sent me a big stack of artwork that he had made in the first weeks of the pandemic and said, just choose what you like and use it as you wish. And over the 2 years there, I had Gonzalo on the podcast several times, and we talked a lot about art. And we talked a lot about art as a form of therapy and as a form of memorial making. And he described to me his process, that when the pandemic started, he started writing down numbers. We were awash in numbers. I just gave you some numbers a moment ago. We have all become econometric activists in some ways. We were just like trying to make sense of how numbers fit into the broader society, into the economy. What does a death count have to do with the national economy? That's most of the way, unfortunately, that the pandemic is framed by the two major political parties in the United States today. But of course, the numbers are just a way into individual lives and into communities. And that's what Gonzalo was exploring with me in the discussion. He talked about just writing the numbers. He was living in Chile at the time. He wanted to move beyond quantities, he said, beyond epidemiological data, and to think about each individual person among the thousands that died as individuals. But interestingly, his choice was not to write names. Names were not available in the main. COVID, that's one of the things about COVID, and it's different in different societies. Certainly here in South Korea, when disasters occur, it's not common that names of the dead are made public. And in the United States is a little different in that regard. It's much easier to get the names of the dead because of public reporting. But in the early days, names were not as easily available. And so he started writing the numbers. And then he made an important move. He started to draw the numbers, paint the numbers. That is, he started to inscribe the numbers with his own emotion, his own creativity. As a practice, he said, to move beyond, to try to understand the enormity of the tragedy that they've been living through, and to honor those who had died. As he said, in Chile and in many countries, the numbers were distorted, and we've never recognized the enormity of the death, he said, and this was 2022. Gonzalo said something then that really impressed me, and that's why I wanted to share it with you at the start of my talk today, that it was an exercise of honoring, that his form of documentation, taking this very idiosyncratic, I think, creative, interesting form. From day one, it had been one of his struggles, he said, and fights to really tell the truth. This was an act of truth-telling. How many people have really died? Now, I had spent some time already in Chile at a disaster research center in 2018 and had gotten to know Gonzalo very well. And so the question that I followed up with, it might seem a little surprising to you, but he and I already had a rapport. And so he talked about truth a little bit. And he said the truth helps us deal with trauma. Truth does not allow us to dissociate. And he's trained as a psychotherapist. And so the concept of dissociation isn't one he just throws around. I mean, it's an important one, and maybe we'll return back to it because we hear a lot these days about why people are not remembering COVID actively. Maybe we've all dissociated from the event. He said that the truth is a dissociation antidote. But I do think it's a crime, and he used the word crime, that we let so many people die. The enormity could have been prevented. Those deaths were by choice. And I followed up on his use of the word crimes, asking him, is he also talking about the crimes of the Pinochet regime? As you may know, for decades, Chile lived under authoritarian rule, and tens of thousands of people were murdered by the regime of Augusto Pinochet. Many of them have never been. Many of those bodies have never been found. Many of those families are still waiting. There's a terrific museum, memorial museum in Santiago that you can visit that begins to tell that story. That museum has only opened in very recent years. The struggle over telling the truth about the crimes of the Pinochet regime, that struggle has continued well into the period of democratization in Chile. There's a time lag between the end of that disaster and the present time, or we might say the disaster is still ongoing. And so when I asked Gonzalo about this and this connection, he said, yes, the painting, in fact, is an intention to reflect colors of the desert. He wanted to paint the desert. He wanted to inscribe these numbers with his own hand on a desert to draw our attention to the disappearance of people from COVID, but also the disappearance of people in the desert, buried, decapitated, burned, in an homage to the relatives who are still looking for bones in the desert. And so this work, and it's a monumental work, it's a wall-size work. It was hanging at the time I talked to him. It had just been hanging, I think, as part of a public art display in Boston, where he spends much of his time teaching. And he said that, when it was hanging, actually, there was a medical conference going on, and he was there to observe and noticed that even though people were so inundated, especially doctors, with numbers and with attempts to, memorial projects, and we're going to talk about that here in a minute, so many memorial projects underway in 2022, that lots of people stopped and lots of people tried to take stock of this piece that it was affecting. And it was affecting in part because it's abstract. It demands that if you choose to interact with it, you have to interact with it on its own terms, its own formal structure, its own use of number, which suggests things. But in the telling, in the description, in the deeper exploration of this artwork as a disaster memorial, it's a memorial to a slow disaster of avoidable death in a society that's only quasi-democratic. And that's Chile. But that could also be South Korea. And that could surely be the United States of America. So that's my opening salvo. And what I want to talk to you about is, and this is kind of a very brief overview of a book that I'm getting started on now called Memory Loss. And the attempt here is to make sense of the way that disaster memory and memorialization emerged in the pandemic, evolved in the pandemic, and is now settling into hard material forms, memorial material forms, which will have impacts for generations to come. I'm structuring it around 3 questions. I really only have time just to kind of suggest these questions to you. I hope at least one of them is interesting enough that you might want to latch onto it and contact me for further conversation, and I'll give you my email at the end, and I hope this will inspire some conversation. But these are the 3 questions that we're going to work with. The first has to do with the fear of losing the past, or maybe the process of finding the past, shall we say. The second has to do with the unsettled feeling that we were losing the present in the middle of the pandemic, which gave rise to an instantaneous memorialization effort. And the third is where we are now, I think, a period of grappling with the loss of memory. It's not that people have stopped thinking about COVID. It's still present every single day in every aspect of our lives, but the discourse around COVID has gone silent, or it's taken other forms, and I think we can talk about that in the Q&A maybe. So let me get right into it. I got a call in March of 2020, as many of my colleagues did who study disasters from, I talked to a lot of journalists in those days. And I got one particular call from a journalist who wanted to know as much information as I was willing to give him about the 1918-1919 pandemic, the influenza pandemic. And so we talked a little bit about that. And I said, and what he wanted to know, the piece was going to be built around specific lessons that were learned from that pandemic that could be mobilized in 2020. So what did we learn from 1918? What have we historians? What do we do with our time anyway, right? We collect facts from the past and we put them together, right? And we should be able, when the time comes, to say, we learned these 3 things. Here they are, 1, 2, 3. Follow these things. I was a very disappointing interviewee for this journalist, I have to say. I mean, it was a friendly conversation, but I kept insisting that in many important ways, the lessons of that pandemic are still being learned, which is to say, pandemic preparedness is a continuous flow of events from 1918 to 2020. So the disaster is still going. But that also there were other maybe important historical events to consider as analogs for COVID, not just 1918. Maybe we should think about World War II itself, also World War I. Maybe we should think about the polio pandemic, or maybe we could look at HIV/AIDS, or the 1968 influenza pandemic, which shared some really important, because it also had an important sort of East-West connection and a lot of Western fear of Eastern influenza, the so-called Hong Kong flu. There were some really interesting dynamics there at play around American Orientalism and around ethnic hatred. I thought these could be areas that you could discover in the piece. None of our conversation made it into the newspaper, and I wasn't surprised. And that's fine, because there was a lot of good writing. I mean, John Barry ran a series of opinion pieces. I think he did 3 or 4 of them in the New York Times. He wrote a magisterial book on the great influenza and was a guest on COVID calls. And he did a great job, I think, moving us beyond a simple like lessons learned framework of what the 1918, 1919 influenza meant. Those pieces are good to read. But journalists were looking for any angle they could find. And what they did is they latched on to disease disasters that people had heard of. And that was basically 2, 1918 influenza and the Black Death. Those seemed to be the only 2 that made it into American textbooks, I guess. And so that's where they spent their time. And there was a lot of really, I think, great, nice, very nice pieces. The profiling this woman, Sylvia Goldschall, who had been alive at the time of the pandemic. She was one of many stories that were written like that, or confessional pieces of people reading Camus or reading Daniel Defoe, going back and looking into literature to find, again, some lessons, some concrete lessons they could pull from that past. That is an important part of sense-making in disaster, looking for historical analogs from which we can draw information that we can apply towards our own survival. I'm not faulting that in the least, far be it for a historian to fault that, but there's so much more there that we can do with history. And we should be aware that when we do that kind of rooting around in history, we're looking at some things, but that looking here is focusing our gaze away from other things that we could see. And that's an act of politics. What do I mean by that? Well, let me let Greg Gonsalves, the epidemiologist and MacArthur Award winner and HIV/AIDS activist, let him take the floor and what he thinks about this. I mean, Gonsalves is a pandemic activist. He's a person who, throughout the pandemic, has focused our attention not only on the failures of the public health bureaucracy and the national political bureaucracy in the United States and around the world to deal with COVID, but also to see a HIV/AIDS pandemic as an important historical analog that we should be learning from, and to connect those 2, which is to say, let's also consider that in the COVID pandemic, we should be focusing much of our attention on vulnerable populations. People are not going to die evenly, equally. We can use a collective pronoun. We can use a we in the pandemic, and that's fine, but we should be aware that that we might be covering over historical historically produced vulnerabilities and prejudices. like the LGBTQ population or the African-American population or the indigenous population around the world that suffered from COVID, died from COVID at much higher rates per capita than other groups of people in society. Why? Because they're historically marginalized, because they don't have access to resources, they don't have access to power, they don't have access to reporters. So Gonsalves said, let's not lose this past. As we go looking for a usable past, let's not lose this particular past, which could be more instructive to us about what COVID is going to look like than the 1918 pandemic. And I agree with him. And when we consider HIV/AIDS as a slow disaster, that is to say, a disaster that we have a hard time even pointing to when it started, but you have to start these graphs somewhere. So if we point to the early 1980s, we can say this is a disaster that's claimed over 40 million lives worldwide since 1981. And that presently almost 38 million people are living with HIV around the world, and that has already been through a process in many countries of politicization, of backlash, of hatred against survivors, hatred against victims, of heroic healthcare workers and researchers, and 2-3 generations now of memorial making. And so Gonsalves was describing HIV/AIDS as a slow disaster, which is a useful historical teacher for us as we think about COVID. And I use the concept slow disaster outside of the pandemic realm. I mean, I'm here in South Korea, so this is an image of South Korea, and the blue around the coastline there is land that's disappearing, but this could just as easily be Louisiana or New Jersey or the Netherlands. Slow disaster is a way to think about disasters not as specific atomized events that have a cinematic beginning, a middle, and end. That's usually how disasters are framed by disaster management bureaucracies. But the linkages across disasters are what I'm interested in. And those linkages often leave traces, but they may not be documentary. Those traces of connection over time might recede into human memory, into memorials, as we're talking about today, or into the land, into the archaeological record, or with climate change, into the atmosphere. So let me come back to the question I used to frame this part of the talk. How did COVID propel a search for a usable disaster past? And a usable past is an old idea, I think first quoted by Van Wyck Brooks, but this idea that societies create a usable past for themselves, that some sort of a collective past that we draw upon as a storehouse to make sense of the present. And so if our textbooks have 2 health disasters in them, those will be the ones we'll pay attention to. If HIV/AIDS is not mentioned, or polio is not mentioned, but 1918 is mentioned, then we're going to rely on the ones we've learned. And that's not an argument against learning about 1918. It's also an argument about learning about 1918 in much greater depth. And one of the questions that we often faced in the early part of the pandemic as people went looking for the usable past of 1918 is, where is it? How come there's no outpouring of books? Where are all the journals? Where are all the letters? These are the questions that were asked. Now, the cranky historian answer is, well, not everything has been put on the internet yet. I know that's hard for people to believe. It's hard for me to believe, and I'm a practicing historian. Why can't it all be there for me when I'm ready for it? But it's not there yet. You have to go into an archive. You have to nurture a relationship with archives. We have to fund archives and libraries. So there is a lot about the 1918 pandemic. But it was also coinciding with the World War. And it would coincide, its aftermath would coincide with a period of massive global immigration, migration, and economic dislocation. So if we're looking for one thing called the 1918-1919 flu pandemic, we're not going to find that. What we'll often find is a compound disaster of multiple things working together to make a calamitous age. And that is what we're into right now with COVID. So that, to me, is the lesson. We're not going to find a storehouse of lessons. History is not a guidebook. History is a creative act. When we go into the past, we collect data and stitch it together to frame a story that helps us understand the present. That's not a unique idea to me. E.H. Carr argued that in 1961. The historian doesn't make up the past, but she or he, in the selection and collection of the sources that she or he uses, creates a past which is usable. So when we are afraid of losing the past, we should also be aware that we're actively engaged in the creation of history that we're using in the moment. And that's a process of revealing some things and obscuring others. And it can take a lot of different forms. I mean, this image I'm showing you here, this is, again, Greg Gonsalves was one of the activists that felt that the administration, the Biden administration, was moving too slowly and rolling out vaccine. So they delivered a huge stack of bones to Ron Klain's house in Washington in 2021. This is learning from the sort of street activism theater of his ACT UP days. Gonsalves here is forcing the issue. Which usable past will the administration adopt? Some sort of murky 1918 gauzy, we'll get through this, or something much more present, much more active, and much more about people who suffer both politically as well as physically. That's the history that Gonsalves said we should use. You might have your own cases to bring up from the past. All right, let me turn to my second question. Why did COVID inspire instantaneous memorialization? Okay, this is the work that many of you are directly engaged in right now, so I don't need to explain your work to you. I mentioned COVID calls. That's what I was doing in those 2 years, in part because I wanted to understand. It was my normal research practice. Call around and ask experts what they know, and then write that down. I'm a historian who documents disasters as a social process. And so I'm interested, a lot of times what I do is at what I just did. I'll ask experts, emergency managers, what historical examples are you using to make sense of this fire, of this flood, of this economic collapse? I'm fascinated by the way they use history. One thing that we should note about 2019 and 2020 is that is if you think about the fall of 2019 into the fall of 2020, that is one of the most remarkable periods of global activism we've ever seen. 2019, in a period of total despair over climate inaction among wealthy countries, young people around the world rose up and demanded climate justice. That is just before the pandemic started. It's this huge pro-social act of activism to try to save the future. And then as we moved into 2020 and it became clear this was going to be a global pandemic, activism started with that. And then very rapidly, because of events in Minneapolis and the murder of George Floyd, we moved into a period of Black Lives Matter activism. This is a period of concentrated, fast-moving injustice and appeals for justice in the face of injustice. I interviewed Kristen Urquiza. Many of you know Kristen. She's the founder of Marked by COVID. When her father, Mark Anthony Urquiza, died in the spring of 2020, she blamed disinformation on his death. She blamed the failure of elected leaders, particularly Donald Trump and the governor of Arizona, for his death. And she wrote what has now come to be called an honest obituary. This is one excerpt from the obituary that she wrote for her father, in which she lays his death at the feet of elected officials who should have cared more, should have done their job more effectively. I was totally stunned by Kristen's poise, the clarity of her message, the sophistication of her activism, but I shouldn't have been, because Kristen was already deeply involved in climate activism up to this point. She was already an activist, and she put those tools to work in the injustice that reached into her own family. But that's just one form of instantaneous memorialization. The other form that many of us participated in, that I participated in, were social media memorials, which were taking shape literally every day. I mean, I talked with people who founded social media memorials. I got as many of them as I could on COVID calls. I had several calls with Alex Goldstein, the founder of Faces of COVID, which started really as just an online obituary project without I mean, most of these projects, they have been recast as sort of liberal. I'm not even going to offer any grace to people who characterize them this way. Let me just put it this way. They have been highly politicized now. But at the time, if you look into the motivation, people were reacting out of fear, out of care, out of concern, out of a pro-social desire to make community in the face of disaster. Some of these projects were really, really creative in terms of just trying to get people together, again, socially distanced, but still together, and making memorials was one way to do that. Heather Schulte created a textile project called Stitching the Situation. This is a square that she stitched about her uncle Joe, and she tells the story of her uncle's COVID diagnosis and ultimately his death in the textile. And she would, I don't know if she still does it, actually, I haven't talked to her quite recently, but she would mail out a kit to you if you wanted to stitch the situation of your own family at home and then send it back to her for the creation of this larger textile. But in her community, she was hosting stitching parties where people were getting together and talking through their fears and their losses. You all know the Who We Lost project, the pandemic journaling project, several other projects that took the form of what we might call analog in the digital. It is to say, to slow things down. Maybe people are composing on their keyboard, but to give them the time and the space to write something that's more than a Facebook post or a tweet, and then put it into a collection which itself will serve as a kind of memorial like this. Right? Nice, light, easy to carry. The written word, the analog and the digital, giving people a community that can be constructed through words that slows their thinking in productive ways, I think, beyond just the emotional and the reactionary that the instantaneous digital memorials we're creating. I know you're already going to hear more about this, but of course, maybe a more conventional memorial approach, but still quite brilliant, that Suzanne Brennan Furstenberg put together, in America Remember. And to go to the national Capitol and plant flags, that's reenacting a tried and true form of memorial practice, but reinterpreting it for the moment and using the scale of the flags as a way to tell story about the enormity. These flags are Gonzalo Bacigalupe's numbers, but here she's writing with white flags on the canvas of the National Mall. Well, why were we making all of these projects? In part, I think we were making these projects because it is, I hope, still an age of activism. Disaster injustice is real. People have died who didn't need to die. People have suffered who didn't need to suffer. That's injustice. And in free societies, we need to call that what it is, and we need to take action. That was clear throughout 2019 and 2020. But also, sociologically speaking, billions of people were at home, if they could be, isolated and online. And you all know this intuitively, and we know it statistically. Never have so many people spent so much time grappling to make online community. Those communities can take many forms. At home, online, trying to make sense of fast-moving events, and also in an online environment in which there are actors at work putting conspiracies and disinformation into the ecosystem. The creation of what communication researchers call an infodemic, a pandemic of information which flows into the information ecosystem, some of it wrong but unintentional, some of it wrong intentionally, like the Plandemic video created by Judy Mikovits. Plandemic and the America's frontline doctors tell a story of the shadowy cabal of vaccine manufacturers working in league with public health bureaucrats to try to force Americans to stay home, become fearful, become socially isolated, and take a vaccine which will do who knows what, they might say, kill you, make you a pawn of the state, put a tracking device in your arm. The argument took many, many different forms. It also converged with the QAnon conspiracy theory, and all of those conspiracy theories ultimately converge with much deeper, darker historical conspiracy theories around that gravitate back to anti-Semitism. And you don't have to go very far into pandemic to find the anti-Semitism right there, and the white nationalism right there. But these masquerading as a helpful public health documentary, Plandemic, as illustrated here, had such a remarkable uptake because people were seeking information. And that's what we want. Disaster researchers, we want people seeking information. And in fact, the research shows when people consume rumors or misinformation in a disaster, that doesn't actually necessarily have a negative impact over a long period of time. It means they're seeking information. That's not a bad thing. The bad thing is when bad actors get into that ecosystem and poison it and turn that very normal desire for strong connection to information into something which can inspire hate and violence. The other process at work here, this is a concept coined by my brilliant friend Malka Older, is the idea of a lag, what she calls a corona lag. So not only was disinformation and conspiracy theorizing very much moving through the system, but there were a lot of lags in the information, even among institutions that were trying to give information up to date. When we were online, we were experiencing a community, but when we got offline and we looked out into the street or we listened for sirens, people were experiencing very different worlds, and that created a cognitive dissonance that she calls a corona lag. And then there were people just actively manufacturing disbelief. And I'm not going to give this too much airtime, but you know who those people are, and you know the spaces that they went to try to stoke fear, to try to use the opportunity of the pandemic to sell products. There's been a recent, came out just a couple of weeks ago, looking at tax records of anti-vaccine activists, showing the vast amounts of money that they made throughout the pandemic. This is a business for them. This is a grift. And there may be people, and I don't want to diminish, I'm certainly not here to tell people that vaccine skepticism is wrong, and I'm not an epidemiologist. But being skeptical and using vaccine skepticism as a tool to trick people at the risk of their own lives and make money off of them, those are very different things. So this was explained to me in a sort of a grand theory by Kate Starbird, the brilliant disaster information researcher at the University of Washington, who herself has come under scrutiny by the Republican Congress and was called in to testify, and she's been targeted. She's had to go offline. But she pointed out to me in a COVID Calls episode in August of 2020, I'm sorry, this was 2022, that after the January 6th attacks, they found out that a lot of people involved in the pandemic video were also there on January 6th. This is a broader ecosystem of actors who are trying to use fear of the pandemic to accomplish political ends. So how were we losing the present, and what does that have to do with instantaneous memorialization? I think these things are connected. I think the first wave of COVID instant memorials was part of a kind of predictable pro-social outpouring, which was online because many people as possible who were not first responders were online. It also revealed quite quickly that disasters don't exist in a world time out of mind, time out of politics. Disasters are reflections of the politics that we've created. And so the speed of events, bureaucratic dysfunction, mounting deaths that come in waves and lags, all of these produced fear and concern and information seeking, but also activism. And that took shape online and in other kinds of memorials. And then lastly, the unreliability of the digital media in an active disinformation era led to what I call a pandemic infodemic convergence. The pandemic and the infodemic came together into something which I think we could consider a compound disaster. And we're living in it right now. Okay. I should be coming towards the end. So this last part, I'm just going to take 5 minutes. I think, is that okay, Sebastian? Am I all right on time with that? All right. Memory loss. This is the part I'm still working out, and so your thoughts will be very useful to me. I had the opportunity, since I've been in Korea, to work closely with the Sewol Ferry bereaved family community. We're coming up on 10 years since the Sewol Ferry sank, killing 304 people, 250 of whom were high school students on their way to a high school trip in Jeju Island. An avoidable disaster. Bereaved families have worked incredibly hard and creatively to create institutions of memory here in Korea. This is Jindo Island. This red lighthouse is the place where families had to gather in April and May of 2014 to wait for the bodies to be brought up from the ship and to identify their children. And in the center panel is Puja Jung, who I've gotten to know. She identifies herself as Hosang's mom. Most of the bereaved families identify themselves first and foremost as parents. That's literally how they identify themselves. And she last year told me the story. I'd known her for several years, but she told me the story of that day in identifying Hosang. And she said something quite amazing to me. She said, I'm losing these memories. And this is distressing to her. I'm just going to leave that brief anecdote there, but I think it's important as we consider the work of memorialization. Who is it serving? How long should people be engaged with it? Memory is a form of healing, but memory can also be a form of continuing trauma. It's not all very clear cut. And in fact, this is a space where social science and medicine interact to a certain degree, but they're separate tracks of research here. I was really moved by Puja sharing with me that this most terrible thing that had happened in her life was also a memory that she was losing, and that was also distressing to her. We know that the vulnerable populations, particularly elderly populations, suffered and continue to suffer from COVID at disproportional rates. So memory loss in terms of COVID has to do first and foremost, I think, with calling back to this section, the second section of my talk, the fear that we had that we were losing the present. We've got to make sure people don't forget this terrible thing we're going through. That's a kind of memory loss that we spend a lot of time thinking about. But we should also think about that generation of elders who were lost, who with them took the collective memory of their generation, and the other vulnerable populations who died at disproportionate rates, who took the histories and the fabric of their own community with them. This rapid generational loss was staggering. And I still think we haven't fully understood, particularly in more rural communities and smaller towns. Some of this research has been done in Italy, for example, where an entire generation of elders died in March and April of 2020. What are the long-term impacts of that? Long COVID. Some staggering percentage of people who've had COVID are going to have long COVID. And their interaction with it might be intermittent. And so their memory of being a victim and a survivor will be brought up again and again. Memory is not something that is linear, and it's not something that is closed one time. It can be reopened again and again. And I mentioned earlier, of course, the intersecting traumas and activisms of 2019 and 2020. The Black Lives Matter community was making an argument not only about the death of Black people in 2020, but about a much longer history, which has not been treated in American history as a usable past. Why not talk about slavery as a usable past for disaster? That one's there. 401 years as of 2020 of a usable past to talk about vulnerability unnecessary death and injustice. Many of you might be familiar with the work of Robert Lifton. I think, as always, Lifton to me is an inspirational figure. Still writing, still researching. Lifton was the first non-Japanese person to do a large-scale, the first person in the world to do a large-scale study with Hiroshima bombing survivors. And he found many, many important things. One of the things I wanted to point to here is that memory that looks like it may be lost, may be only delayed. Many people who survived the atomic bomb attacks didn't speak of the attacks and their experience of those events until the 1970s or 80s or even later. And so that's not memory loss, that's memory delayed or deferred. So what's the difference between forgetting and healing? Let me bring it back to Gonzalo Bascalupe. I mean, I think there's knowledge to be gained here sitting at the crossroads of memorialization practice and what we might call in public health terms trauma reduction. But I think we need a lot more research here. There is a small but vocal group of researchers who say that perpetuating memory, disaster memory through memorialization re-traumatizes victims. It's the wrong way to go. We want to help people heal and move on. But that's focused on disaster as a trauma felt only by the group of people who were physically there. We experience disasters at global scale now. And so what about intergenerational loss and trauma? Shouldn't we think about memorialization as a trauma reduction strategy, maybe even for people who haven't been born yet? And what types of memorials do we need? What kind of a COVID memorial do we need for a person who hasn't been born yet? That might be a way of asking this question. And what's the difference between forgetting and healing? People who have not been born yet are still going to need healing from the disaster of COVID. What kind of memorials can be made to promote that healing and at the same time avoid authoritarianism? So I want to close back with Gonzalo and his painting in the desert. Gonzalo refuses to lose the past, but he demands that the past be more complicated than a single disaster. The past is a process. The past he's invoking here with his painting is a process of loss, dislocation, and health interconnected with politics. The slow disaster of state violence, enshrined in the Pinochet era and continuing on to health dysfunction in contemporary Chile. That's Gonzalo's argument. And he's not losing the present because he made something. He made a memorial. He made a lot of memorials. He's a very prolific artist. And you can check out his work on the COVID Calls website. And he made this work as a tool to heal people. This is his attempt to answer my question, the difference between forgetting and healing. He said in some cases he intentionally blurred or smudged the numbers as a way to indicate that some people will move out of this community. They will heal or forget or move on or drop out of this community, but others will enter this community as well. And so disaster memorials have that possibility to function not only as instruments of healing for people engaged in a disaster as an event, but also as a process to reduce disaster injustice for generations to come. I'll stop there. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Professor Knowles. That was an excellent presentation. I hope everyone can hear me okay. All right. So we will be moving on to the questions and answers period now. So we will go ahead and open the chat. Lane, if you could get that going for us. If anyone has a question for Professor Knowles, please feel free to send it there, and I will try to get to as many as possible. While we are waiting for people to type out their questions, I know Professor Grinker had one, so I will shift to him first, and we will move on from there.
Dr. Knowles, thank you for really magnificent talk. It was sweeping, evocative, inspiring, covered so many issues so succinctly that it's hard to know where to begin in asking a question. But I did want to ask you if you could clarify the concept of slow disaster a little bit. The concept of slow disasters sort of suggests that there is something which is a fast disaster. And yet, your perspective seems to suggest that even something which would be potentially in our minds fast, like a hurricane, would still be slow because the hurricane's effects, who suffers more or less, might be affected by pre-existing systemic conditions. So I just wanted to ask you to clarify, is that sort of a false dichotomy between slow and fast, or is your concept slow supposed to be for you, a heuristic to tell us that all disasters are in fact slow?
I couldn't have said that any better, Roy. I mean, I think you really went right to the heart of it. Let me just start with where the concept emerged from. The concept is not original to me. I mean, it's in conversation with Rob Nixon's idea of slow violence. And other researchers who for decades have talked about time scale and flow of time as something we should pay attention to when we talk about disaster. But the default mechanism of the disaster management state is disaster as event. That is to say, something with a tightly bounded time frame. And if you go onto the Federal Emergency Management Agency website, for example, in the United States, or any other related emergency management website anywhere in the world, they usually have what they call a emergency management cycle diagram, which talks about phases of disasters. There's this sort of long lead-up phase that they don't worry about much, that's somebody else's problem. And then there's preparedness, which is the days leading up to, say, a hurricane, and then response, where they usually spend 90% of their money and the great majority of their time. And that's politically framed because disaster management bureaucracies exist in free societies, in governments that have to be accountable to citizens. So it's not my criticizing them, it's my pointing out the timescales within which we have created the polity of disaster response, right? So slow disaster is exactly as you say. It's a heuristic which it's simultaneously trying to make us aware of that rush and that boundedness of time, but also what that leads to in terms of our own expectations as citizens. Maybe our expectation is that a disaster should be resolved in 2 weeks afterwards. Well, that's not a good expectation. That's never been accomplished. That's not what disaster recovery actually looks like. So it can actually be to the benefit of emergency managers. And if there's emergency managers here in the room, I'm not here to criticize you. I'm saying I think you're operating under very difficult circumstances, underfunded, and the fast disaster or event disaster framework has served you very poorly. Slow disasters also, though, I want to add, I think the concept really should be attributed also to the sociologist Ulrich Beck, who talked about living in a world full of toxics and nuclear risk, in which, yeah, we can point to Hiroshima, or we could point to 3 Mile Island, or we could point to Chernobyl or Nagasaki, but the reality is that nuclear poisoning is happening all the time around the world. And so it's a disaster which is hard to perceive, hard to measure. It doesn't always manifest itself in terms of clear interaction between the agent and the poison and death. This is something Lifton writes about in Death and Life, that one of the things that Hiroshima survivors pointed to is that they felt that they could die at any time from cancer. That fear, even if it never manifests itself, is a form of slow disaster, grinding on people psychologically and grinding on their community. So I think I'd like to present it in those two ways, both as an ongoing process, which sometimes manifests itself. I'm not so postmodernist to say disaster events aren't real. Water rises and people do drown. But where they drown, why the water rose as quickly as it did in one neighborhood in New Orleans and not another, that's a factor of maintenance or lack of maintenance of infrastructure and racism that goes back over decades. We have to have those in conversation with one another. Otherwise, we're always just going to be in this kind of state of amnesia. How did we get here? What lessons can we learn? What lessons can we learn from what we've just seen in the last 2 weeks? We will continue to replay the same injustices. And so that's the sense in which I hope to use it.
Professor Kuipers, if you had a follow-up question, you may go ahead and ask that. After that, we will move on to questions that have been posted in the chat.
Yes. Thank you for your talk. I found it very interesting and stimulating. But I did have a question that follows up on Professor Richard Grinker's comments about slow and fast disasters. But I was, where I'm coming from is having read your op-ed in the New York Times, where you talk about how former President Trump, for example, was able to suggest that only a dozen people or so had died as a result of a hurricane hitting Puerto Rico, while the official number of 3,000 dead, he assumed then must have been due to certain evil agents like Democrats trying to make him look bad. And you seem to be arguing, though, that Trump's definition of disaster is rooted in the kind of 1960s era event-based models that focus on these nuclear blasts. And I was just wondering, sort of empirically, if you can give, are there other examples of, say, US or other officials strategically using nuclear blast analysis based interpretations to undercount disaster effects?
Well, thank you for that. Thanks for reading that old op-ed. That got me my first death threat. Not unusual in the Trump age, I think. That yeah. So what I was trying to get at in that piece, and maybe to answer your question, is that the majority of funding for disaster research in the United States, but also in Britain and Western Europe, I'll just speak about those places, up until September 11, 2001, was in preparation for nuclear attack. And so there was a tight fit between the way that social scientists framed their questions and the kind of research that they were to do and what the patrons wanted. And what their patrons wanted was models of social resilience, we would call it resilience now, in the midst of disaster. Right? And so they used very tightly bounded temporal models because the event started when the nuclear blast hit. And then the counter was going from then to the point at which society was going to hold together and government could be continuous, or that society was going to fall apart and then government would break apart. And so that is the research. And one of the fascinating things, if you want to look into it, the Disaster Research Center at the University of Delaware is the descendant of this original funding from the US Department of Defense. If you look at their old studies, they pointed out again and again and again in their studies, communities are more resilient than we give them credit for. Pre-existing social conditions will actually shape the way that people respond to disaster, and people do not wait for external authority to come in and tell them what to do. They take action creatively in the midst of disaster. And if you're at all aware of the way that emergency management grew out of civil defense in the United States, you know it had a lot to do with creating maps and command and control diagrams. And when I was a kid, running the air raid siren every Saturday at noon in Arlington, Texas, it was very performative around command and control. In other words, they learned nothing from the social science. And that shouldn't surprise us. I think, I mean, they paid for these studies, but they didn't operationalize them, because actually where the military planners were coming from was a need to map a nation of citizen soldiers who were going to do what they were told in the face of this one overwhelming disaster. So that event frame of the nuclear attack was incredibly strong. And then in the 1990s, and I could talk way too much about this. So let me just say that in the 1990s, there was a kind of a moment of kind of emergency management revolution because it was the era of the peace dividend. The Cold War was over. And emergency managers were free to say, you know, nuclear attack is not the dominant disaster paradigm that we should have anymore. We should think about other things. And the first IPCC report had just come out. It was a really remarkable era. And then 9/11 came, and those old Cold War manuals got back out, and the creation of a counterterrorism state followed in the direct footsteps of that sort of older Cold War mentality about a disaster as an event from an external agent, disconnected from a past, and basically focused entirely on continuity of government and continuity of economy. So my too long answer to your question is the Bush administration, the Obama administration, but interestingly, not the Clinton administration and not the very end of the George H.W. Bush administration. Those would be two, if you were interested to look into the political science of disaster management in America, where they were looking for other models. The 90s is a fascinating period to look, but I think right now we live still as inheritors of that Cold War event focus.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
And next I will start to get to some questions from the chat. So I will read out the first question from Michael Iadamarco. I hope I'm pronouncing your name right. I apologize. It reads, accepting your overall framework, although there are things we don't know or understand about the 1918 Great Influenza and its neighboring historical context and subsequent disasters, as you described, we do know a lot. The gap in translating that knowledge into societal changes that could have been helped us more with the COVID-19 response may be the result of our collective failure to act on things we learned. In many ways, 1917 to 1922 map well with 2020 to 2025. So thinking about your three questions, what do they or one of them say about what we need to do this time? By a public health practitioner who retired last week.
Okay. What an interesting and important question, and I think a helpful invitation for me to say a little bit more about 1918, 1919. So like many people, I also was scouring everything I could read about 1918, 1919 in March of 2020. And one of the things that really struck me was actually the persistence of waves and how those waves actually went well on for years. And the creation of public health accounting, a sort of a public health accounting bureaucracy, which already existed in some places but had not yet become like what we would consider now a kind of more formal and mature public health bureaucracy in terms of counting cases and counting deaths. And I would point you to the work of Jacqueline Wernemont, who's a terrific scholar who's written she's written going back into early modern Europe, trying to make sense of the history of death accounting practices. And so that history of the presence or absence of literally lists of the dead is something that we can, that was something that in 1918, they were trying to take stock of. Who has actually counted this many deaths before and under what circumstances? So that's one frame, which is to say that the history is more nuanced and interesting. And as we look back, the point I'm trying to make here, as we look back to 1918, we should also keep in mind what historical models they were working with at that time to try to build up their own response. I think at the heart of your question, though, is, yeah, if we get off the focus of 1918 and particularly the sort of event of the pandemic and the longer period of time, the sort of slow disaster of 1918, I think we find a lot of interesting things. We can find that there were health effects, there seem to be health effects that carry on for people into the 1920s that then coincide with malnutrition and other kinds of diseases which increase in the 1930s as a result of the Great Depression. I think we also can find that the something we talk about now in the bereavement literature, the unfortunate creation of families that lose a breadwinner or that lose a son or a daughter, and that mourning, what we now would call PTSD, didn't have yet a way to talk about that. It manifests itself in other ways. So scholars who look at material culture, what we now, again, I was trying to draw a parallel with this kind of instantaneous memorialization efforts that happen today. So many of which are actually very highly personal on Facebook or on Twitter, where people would have a picture of a loved one and some mementos. I think that there's really interesting historical analogs for that going back into the 1918, 1919 pandemic. So I don't want to call those lessons. I want to call those kind of echoes, I guess, that we can pay attention to. What does that mean for us now? I think it means quite simply that we should be thinking about analogs of 1918, 19 in the way we think about long COVID, making it socially acceptable for people to continue to seek treatment after they're supposedly past the disease, and also to take very seriously that their period of mourning could not yet even have really started, depending on how much they rely on what kind of economic support from family members who've been sick, who died, and the total impact of that has yet been felt. So I guess it's kind of, in some ways, from the overall of my talk, it's not surprising to you that I want to look for 1918 in the 1930s. And that means we should be building the infrastructures now to continue to take stock of 2020, 21, and 22 in the years that are going to follow. But I mean, our research right now needs to be gathering steam, not shutting down.
Our next question is from Cindy Johnson from the chat. She would like to know your thoughts about the state of Florida removing the teaching of slavery in schools and how you think it might affect society at large.
I'm so pleased that that question emerges from this talk. Yeah, it's an act of violence. Restricting the teaching of truth with a political aim is an injustice. And it's, I mean, you know, African-American historians of the African-American experience would tell us that that's nothing new. The backlash against teaching Black history, how many times have we seen that? There was a backlash against it in the 1970s, in the 1950s, in the 1940s, in the 19-teens. Every time there seems to be some civil rights progress or activism, there has been a backlash in the United States against that teaching. And so what will be the long-term impact of that? Maybe I can bring it back to the talk at hand. What's the relationship between the DeSantis administration clamping down on teaching the history of slavery and public health in Florida? That's the question I want to ask. That's the question I want to ask. And I think we can say we don't have to look very far for the answer to that. Look at states that have not taught African-American history or the history of slavery robustly in their public schools. And what's the relationship between that and the persistence of Confederate symbols or Confederate monuments? It's been acceptable to have monuments to what has been perceived as the slow disaster of the Confederate loss in the South. I'm from Texas, so let me speak from experience. The persistence of a Johnny Reb statue in a county courthouse, in front of a county courthouse, that goes on today in Texas. That is not unrelated. That is not unrelated from the persistence of health vulnerability in the Black population of a state. So my answer is, it is on its face an act of violence, but it also continues to construct a culture of disproportionate death when disasters occur. So I guess I'm making a pretty strong case for teaching the truth.
Yeah, thank you very much. Our next question is from Douglas. He would like to know, do disasters resolve faster when it affects the majority rather than the few or minority? What are your thoughts on that?
What was the first part? I'm sorry.
Sorry, Do you think that disasters resolve faster when they affect the majority rather than the few or the minority?
Yeah, do they resolve faster? That's a really interesting question, because what you might theorize from that is that in a democracy, if a disaster is affecting a majority, then it would get a lot of attention of elected officials. And I think that if we look into 2020, the political decision of the Trump administration to get behind Operation Warp Speed is maybe one answer to Douglas's question. That Trump saw political advantage in promoting this program, and it was structured in such a way that it wasn't that it was politically expedient for him as well. It didn't force him to do something that would go against his base, not yet. But what we've seen recently, I don't know if you've followed this, I don't know how closely you watch Trump campaign speeches, but he stopped talking about the vaccine in his campaign speeches because he was getting booed. There's I think probably a minority, but still a vocal one among his base, which thinks that the government being involved in vaccine development and delivery in 2020 and 21 in the United States was a mistake. And so that's something to keep an eye on in this next election. I mean, COVID is going to be very much part of this election season. It's not getting nearly the coverage that it needs to. But to come back to your, I think, quite provocative question, do disasters resolve more quickly when they affect the majority? I think the development of the vaccine in the United States is one example to the positive of that. But I mean, look at the opposite, climate change inaction. There's no disaster around the world that affects, I mean, there's COVID, but there's, climate change will affect even more people. And inaction in the United States is staggering, and so I think we can't generalize in that way. I think maybe what we should focus more of our attention on is the way that political power is wielded in society. And political power is not always wielded by the majority. Political power can, even in democratic societies, be wielded by minorities who've structured the polity such that the minority rule. And I think in an instance like that, we'll see that people who have greater access to political power are going to have greater access to making their case that their disaster that they're concerned about is going to get attention and that others are going to be left behind. But I think, and I'm going to get in trouble for saying this as a historian, but I do think 2020, particularly the months from March to July or August, was a quite special time of disruption of political norms in the United States. I think they settled back in to predictable political norms by the fall of 2020, but I think you had Republicans in many states and in the White House acting in ways that you might not necessarily have predicted in those months. And so, if we want to have an idea that a democracy is the right form of government, I agree with that, and that a democracy is the best form of government to deal with disaster when it affects the majority, I think we could look to April of 2020 and say, yeah, that seems to be working. But by April of 2021, I'm not so sure.
Yeah, thank you. I will ask another question, this time from Martha Greenwald. She says, one thing that I see a lot recently with the Who We Lost project is that people relate to me that they are glad the site exists, but they want me to know that they cannot yet write a story. It's not that they don't want to write, but that they cannot because their trauma inhibits them. How does this fit into the crossroads of memorialization and trauma reduction? Is it self-induced trauma reduction spurred on by the politics and social media's dominance over the topic? I assume this occurs with other disasters, but I don't know.
Yeah, I've been thinking a lot about that problem, and I had to zoom past it very quickly in the talk. A lot of the work I've been doing here, as I mentioned, is with learning from Sewol Ferry bereaved families and also Fukushima bereaved families and survivors. And next week, actually, I'm taking a group to Fukushima and we're bringing a young person who's a Sewol ferry survivor to meet with young people who are survivors in Fukushima. And this young person, the Sewol ferry survivor, she, Ga-young Yu, she wrote a book. And she wrote the book and published it last year. So that's 8.5 years after the disaster for her. And the book in part is about her process of getting to the point where she could write a book. In other words, a lot of the sort of self-exploration in the book is just about finding how to find a voice and what to say. And one thing I'm learning as I work with her and work with other younger people who are maybe in their 20s who've lived through these disasters, but they were not yet adults when they happened. And this ties back to the pandemic infodemic issue, is that they were shielded by their parents, and in some cases shielded by law from speaking publicly, because they were targets of online predation. And so it's not only a process, and this is why I asked this, I think it's a complicated intersection, it's a complicated space, because their voice was taken from them preemptively because of the fear of their parents that if they spoke up, they would become targets of continuing violence in public, or maybe even physical violence. And I think we see that in the United States with teenagers who are survivors of mass shootings. So sometimes finding the voice is not just about some kind of a therapeutic process, which probably involves many different kinds of experts, therapy, family members, care of a community, maybe memorials, but also that people just literally, their voices have been silenced because the larger atmosphere is too dangerous to hear from them. Now, what will be the long-term impact of that? I don't know. But I mean, if we look at the case of Hiroshima, it's not surprising that many Hiroshima survivors didn't speak until the 1970s or 80s because there was very strong social stigma, particularly for women, of marrying a woman who was a Hiroshima survivor. So they were literally keeping that information to themselves, not writing about it, because if it was known, people wouldn't marry them because they were afraid they would give birth to children with birth defects. But I think we have, Martha, some historical examples to work with in this regard. Like I called it a sort of delay, a kind of, it's not necessarily even maybe a delay of healing, but a delay of storytelling. And so that to me is also one of the reasons we need intergenerational capacity in our memorials, that maybe some of these stories might not come out until people have passed. That maybe the story gets passed on to the next generation. And that's exactly what's happening in Hiroshima. They have a very vibrant interview project where grandchildren are interviewing grandparents who survived, because those grandparents, and those stories will never be made public until, some of them, as I understand it, until those grandparents die, because they literally don't want the story told while they're living. So I've given you mostly anecdotal answers to your question. It's a deep question. Do you want to follow up or have a response to that? I'd love to hear from you on it.
In the meantime, yeah,
talk.
yeah, of course. I will let Martha, answer that. In the meantime, we are running on we're running out of time, so I will accept 2 more questions. I will do another one from Ms. Johnson, and I also have a question first from Professor Jorge Benavides-Rawson. So if you would like to go ahead and ask his question.
Hello, and thank you for this presentation. I know you remember me. I was a guest in your podcast back in episode 150 something. So
yeah, I'm delighted. I was delighted to see your name among the attendants, Jorge. Thanks for coming.
It's great that you went to 500. The question I would like to ask has about to do with policy, but as a historic record, because I've had a student once ask me, So how do we know if we learn any lessons? And that got me thinking about the policies that are written usually right after disasters, at least in public health, but then some get taken back, and the few that remain, like, vaccination policies, drinking water policies, piping policies after John Smith, for example. So have people looked into policies, the way they remain, not as a way of understanding policy itself, but as a historical track record of lessons learned, or can we do that? And sort of like attach it to each episode of disasters, or would that make any sense?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot in that question. I do think that, I'd be curious if you agree with me. I think that I'm going to take the United States because I know that case best. The United States government is not well structured to learn effectively from disaster events. I know that sounds like a weird thing to say, but it's not. It's structured to fund some mechanisms for response and some mechanisms for long-term economic recovery. But learning is harder. And there's a move underway, actually. There's legislation in the Senate to create a National Disaster Safety Board, which would literally be a board like the Chemical Safety Board or the National Transportation Safety Board, which would be composed of experts across disciplines, whose job it would be literally, Jorge, in the aftermath of disaster, to collect data. A lot of times data is privately held, or it's held by public agencies, but they don't surrender it easily. So that give them subpoena power to collect data, and then analyze data and write investigative reports, which become part, just like the GAO. I mean, just become part of a kind of a policy information network, right? It happens at the state level in agencies like CAL FIRE in California. I mean, you can find examples of this where that works in certain places around the country. But at a national level, we don't have it in the United States. And the bill faces a lot of opposition. Why? Because there are people who believe that if we study those disasters very closely, it will inevitably result in doing what? Treating disasters as slow social processes and dealing with the underlying risks, and that is poverty and bad infrastructure. I mean, just to generalize. And those are expensive things to fix. It's more complicated than that, Jorge, but I think if I turn your attention to the debate around the National Disaster Safety Board, maybe you could get into some interesting space there for your own thinking.
All right, our last question comes from Miss Cindy Johnson. She says, there are still 1,500 people dying a week of COVID. That's about 4 Boeing 777s crashing a week. In addition, COVID is presently the third leading cause of death in Americans below heart disease and cancer. How can there be such a laissez-faire attitude to it? As a grieving widow whose loss was due to COVID, it keeps my grief fresh, if that makes sense.
Yeah. I'm really sorry. Thank you for sharing that question, and thank you for sharing your story and for that loss. Yeah, I think it calls back to an earlier question about, well, what happens when the majority loses interest in a disaster? It recedes. It's supposed to, I think, in an ideal society, maybe it's supposed to recede back into the realm where experts continue to work on problems outside of the camera. But we're in such strange political times in the United States that there's disincentives for experts in some states to work on these problems. That they're literally being told not to work on things like vaccine hesitancy in Texas or in Florida. And that is part of a political movement which wants to take power away from experts. I guess my hope is that through projects like this, through a continued demand by people for disaster justice, but also for a longer period of time within which to do our work and the fostering of community to do that work, we'll keep open a kind of an open space, a kind of open civic square for people to talk about their loss and to see that loss turn into useful research, and that we don't have so many unnecessary deaths in the future. But I think it's mean a lot of people who started, let's just start with people who started COVID projects in 2020. I hope you will continue to work on COVID. I mean, just the community that's already put themselves forward as interested in this, the young researchers involved in this project, please consider this a 10 or 20-year or lifetime project, not just something you'll work on for the next couple of years. We need you. You know a lot. I think building a network, a deep and powerful network of COVID researchers is absolutely essential to try to bring down suffering as we go forward.
Thank you, Dr. Knowles. It's Roy Richard Grinker here, closing out our wonderful event. I want to thank you for being so generous with your time. I'd like to thank the audience for their fantastic questions. And I think you've shown us very clearly how in your work as a historian, you have focused on specific disasters, but shown how every disaster can transform the way we think about time and nature and citizenship and suffering, and really, very, very big and important issues. I do want to have everyone see that in the chat, I have put the link to the other two events that we have this week, and that is Pandemic Reflections. And with that, I will thank everyone, sign off, and wish you a wonderful day. And we're going to go to sleep. You're waking up and starting your day. Best wishes to you, and thank you very, very much from the bottom of our hearts and all of our team for all the work you do, both in your scholarship and in your podcasts, in which you're creating such an important archive. Thank you.
Much appreciated. Be well, everyone. Thanks a lot.